The basement of my grandmother's Victorian house in Burlington, Vermont had always been off-limits during my childhood visits. "Nothing down there but dust and memories," she'd say with a dismissive wave. After her passing last winter at 93, the responsibility of clearing out the century-old home fell to me, her only living descendant. The February air bit through my coat as I unlocked the front door. Inside, the house stood silent, frozen in time. Grandma Helen had changed little since. Grandpa died in the 80s. Family photographs lined the hallway, my mother as a teenager, grandparents on their wedding day, relatives I'd never met but whose features I recognized in my own reflection. I saved the basement for last. After a week of sorting through the main floors, I finally faced the narrow door beneath the stairs. The ancient key turned reluctantly in the lock, and hinges protested as I pulled it open. A dank, musty smell escaped, carrying the weight of decades. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight. At the bottom, I fumbled along the wall until my fingers found a string, which I pulled to illuminate a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The weak yellow light revealed a cluttered space filled with forgotten furniture, trunks, and cardboard boxes. In the farthest corner sat an ornate mahogany chest. Unlike everything else covered in dust, this piece appeared recently cleaned. As I approached, I noticed something else, the faint scent of lilacs, Grandma's favorite perfume. The chest wasn't locked. Inside, nestled in velvet lining, lay a large leather-bound album with Caldwell Family -1902 embossed in faded gold lettering. My hand trembled slightly as I lifted it. The Caldwells were my great-great-grandparents who had built this house in 1898. I carried the album upstairs to the kitchen table. The leather cover was cool to the touch, the pages thick and yellowed at the edges. Opening it released that distinct smell of aged paper and something else, a medicinal odor I couldn't quite place. The first photograph showed a somber family gathered on the very porch outside, a stern-looking man with a full beard, a woman in a high-necked dress, and 5 children arranged by height. The patriarch, Edward Caldwell, stood rigidly behind his seated wife, Martha. Their expressions were typical of the Irano smiles, just steady gazes at the camera. But the children's eyes, something about them unsettled me. They stared not at the camera but slightly past it, as if watching something just beyond the photographer's shoulder. Their faces were unnaturally pale, their postures too perfect. Below the photograph, in elegant handwriting, were their names: Edward and Martha Caldwell, with children James 12, Thomas 10, Elizabeth 8, Catherine 6, and William 4. Summer 1902. As I turned the page, I found an envelope tucked inside. The paper was thin, almost translucent with age. Inside was a newspaper clipping from the Burlington Free Press, dated April 17, 1901. My coffee cup slipped from my fingers, shattering on the floor as I read the headline: "Tragedy Strikes Caldwell Household. 5 children lost to scarlet fever," according to the article. All 5 Caldwell children had died within a week of each other during a scarlet fever outbreak in spring 1901, more than a year before the photograph in the album was taken. I couldn't sleep that night. The photograph haunted me. 5 children, standing impossibly still, their eyes vacant, yet somehow watchful. Children who, according to documented history, were already a year in their graves when the picture was taken. I told myself there must be a logical explanation. Perhaps the newspaper article was referring to different Caldwell children, or maybe the date on the photograph was wrong. But deep down, I knew the names matched perfectly with birth and death records I'd found in Grandma's papers. The next morning, I called Professor Barrett at the University of Vermont's History Department. As a former student of his, I hoped he might shed light on this macabre discovery. Post-mortem photography was common practice in that era, he explained after I described the album. Families often posed their deceased loved ones for one final portrait, but Professor, these children died in 1901. The album says the photo was taken in 1902. A long pause followed. "Oh, are you certain of both dates? The newspaper clipping is unmistakable and the date is written clearly on the photograph." "This is unusual," he admitted. "Would you mind if I came by to see it?" Professor Barrett arrived that afternoon, bringing with him a magnifying glass and white cotton gloves. He was older than when I'd taken his American history course 15 years ago, but his methodical approach remained unchanged. He examined the album carefully, studying each photograph with his magnifying glass. There were 12 photos in total, each featuring the Caldwell family in different settings around the property: a picnic by the lake, gathering on the front steps, seated in the parlor. In every image, the children maintained the same rigid posture, the same empty yet penetrating stares. "These are not post-mortem photographs," he finally declared, removing his glasses. "The positioning is all wrong. In death photography, families went to great lengths to make the deceased appear alive, propping them up, opening their eyes, sometimes even painting pupils onto the developed photograph. These children, ... quotes, he hesitated, appear to be standing unassisted. Then how do you explain it? I asked. I can't, he admitted, not without seeing the negatives. As the professor continued his examination, I noticed something I'd overlooked in each successive photograph. The children appeared slightly different, not in their poses or expressions, but in their substance. In the first image, they seemed solid. By the final photograph, they appeared almost translucent, as if fading from existence. Professor Barrett noticed it too. The emulsion techniques of early photography could sometimes create unusual effects, he suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. As he was leaving, he paused at the door. There was a photographer in Burlington during that period, George Winters. He had a reputation for experimental techniques. The Historical Society might have records of his work. After the professor left, I returned to the album. Something compelled me to look more closely at the backgrounds of the photographs. In the corner of the parlor image, a mirror hung on the wall. The parents' reflections were clearly visible. The children cast no reflections at all. The Burlington Historical Society occupied a converted Federal-style home near the waterfront, Miss Abernathy. The archivist was initially reluctant to discuss George Winters. His work is controversial, she explained, leading me through rows of filing cabinets. Technically brilliant, but ethically questionable by today's standards. What do you mean? She pulled out a slim folder. Winters was fascinated with the concept of capturing the soul through photography. After losing his own daughter to tuberculosis in 1898, his work took a disturbing turn. The folder contained several articles about Winters, including an interview from 1904, where he claimed to have developed a technique for preserving the essence of the departed. Critics dismissed him as a charlatan preying on grieving families, but his photographs were in high demand among the bereaved wealthy. Did he ever work for the Caldwell family? I asked. Miss Abernathy consulted her records. Yes, Edward Caldwell commissioned him multiple times. The last record we have is from September 1902. She hesitated before pulling out another file. This might interest you. It's from Edward Caldwell's journal, donated by a relative in the 1950s. The journal entry, dated August 12, 1902, read, Martha's condition worsens. The doctor says her mind is slipping away, but I know the truth. She sees them too. Last night she screamed that Elizabeth was standing at the foot of our bed, water dripping from her hair, asking why we let them go to the lake that day. But we never took them to the lake. They never lived to see that summer. Winters promises this album will bring her peace, that capturing their images will allow their souls to rest. I am desperate enough to believe him. My hands trembled as I read the entry. What happened to Martha Caldwell? She was committed to the Vermont State Asylum in October 1902. She died there 6 months later. And Edward? Found hanging in the attic of their home in 1903. She lowered her voice. There were rumors he left a note claiming the children had come for him. As I drove back to the house, a sudden rainstorm erupted. Through the blur of raindrops on my windshield, I glimpsed 5 small figures standing by the roadside. When I blinked, they were gone. Back at the house, I found water pooling on the kitchen floor. Looking up, I saw a dark stain spreading across the ceiling, a leak from the attic. I would need to check it before it caused serious damage. The pull-down attic stairs creaked as I ascended. I hadn't been up here during my previous cleaning efforts. The space was cluttered with old furniture and boxes, illuminated only by a small circular window. In the center of the room stood an antique camera on a wooden tripod covered by a faded cloth. My heart raced as I approached it. The brass plate on its base read G. Winters, Burlington, VT. Beside the camera sat a small table holding several glass negatives. When I held one up to the fading daylight, I saw the inverted image of the Caldwell family, parents solid and clear, children appearing as dark, indistinct shapes. A notebook lay open beside them, the handwriting matching that in the album. Final session tomorrow. The process is nearly complete. The children appear less substantial with each exposure, their spirits transferring to the plates. Martha believes they are finally finding peace, but I fear we have merely trapped them between worlds. Last night I heard singing from the empty nursery, Elizabeth's voice, though she has been gone nearly 18 months. The house grows colder. The lake calls to us all. That night the temperature in the house plummeted. My breath clouded before me as I huddled under blankets, unable to shake the chill that had settled in my bones. Outside the rain continued, drumming against the roof and windows. Sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of cold water filling my lungs and 5 pairs of eyes watching from the darkness. I woke repeatedly to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, light and quick, like children playing. At 3:17 a.m. I jolted awake to the sound of a music box playing. The delicate melody drifted up from somewhere below. Grandma had collected music boxes. I'd packed several away during the week, but none should have been wound. I followed the sound to the parlor where moonlight filtered through lace curtains. On a side table sat a small silver music box I didn't recognize, its lid open, the tiny ballerina inside spinning slowly. As I approached, the music stopped abruptly. The room temperature dropped so suddenly that frost formed on the inside of the windows. A child's laughter echoed from the kitchen, followed by the sound of running water. The kitchen sink was overflowing, water cascading onto the floor. Standing before it was a small figure, a girl in a white nightgown, her back to me. Her hair hung in wet ropes down her back, water pooling at her bare feet. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure turned slowly. Where her face should have been was only a blur, like an overexposed photograph. She raised one dripping hand, pointing toward the basement door, which stood open, darkness gaping beyond. When I blinked, she was gone, but the water continued to flow from the tap. With shaking hands, I shut it off and grabbed a flashlight from a drawer. Something was drawing me toward the basement. The beam of light danced across the walls as I descended the stairs. The musty scent had intensified, now mixed with the unmistakable smell of lake water and wet earth. In the center of the floor, where the concrete had cracked with age, water was seeping up from below, forming a widening puddle. Beside it lay the album, open to a photograph I hadn't seen before. The 5 children standing at the edge of a lake, their parents nowhere in sight. A sudden crash from upstairs sent me running back up the stairs. In the parlor, every framed photograph had fallen to the floor, glass shattered across the hardwood. As I stood among the broken frames, the telephone rang, startling me so badly I dropped my flashlight. It was 3:33 a.m. No one would be calling at this hour. I answered with a trembling hello. Static crackled on the line. A child's voice emerged from the white noise. "We never went to the lake." The line went dead. As I stood frozen, clutching the silent receiver, wet footprints appeared on the floor before me, small bare feet walking from nowhere. I fled the house with nothing but my car keys and the clothes on my back, driving through the rain to the nearest motel. As dawn broke, I called Professor Barrett, voice shaking as I recounted the night's events. "The Caldwell children never drowned," he said after a long silence. "They died of scarlet fever. But local legend says Martha was so grief-stricken she began to hallucinate alternate deaths for them. In her madness, she believed they had drowned in Lake Champlain." Why would Edward Caldwell mention the lake in his journal then? Perhaps he began sharing her delusion. Grief can distort reality, especially when amplified by suggestion, but I knew there was more to the story. Something connecting the photographs, the lake, and the children's unnatural appearances. I spent the morning researching at the public library, diving into old newspapers and records. By afternoon, I had discovered something disturbing before building the Victorian house. Edward Caldwell had owned another property outside town on the shores of Lake Champlain. That house had burned to the ground in 1897, prompting the family's move to Burlington. More significantly, I found a small article from July 1896 describing a near tragedy. The 3 youngest Caldwell children were rescued from Lake Champlain yesterday after their rowboat capsized. Local fisherman Samuel Warren pulled the children from the water. The 2 eldest Caldwell children remained on shore. They had nearly drowned one summer before the fire, 5 years before the fever took them. Something else caught my eye, a name in the article's final paragraph: the family's housekeeper. Mrs. Georgia Winters suffered a fainting spell upon hearing of the incident. Georgia Winters. Could she be related to the photographer George Winters? The county records office confirmed my suspicion. Georgia was George Winters' wife. She had worked for the Caldwells until 1897, when the family relocated after the fire. By late afternoon, dark clouds again gathered over Burlington. I knew I needed to return to the house to face whatever waited there. But first I made one more stop, the small cemetery on North Avenue where the Caldwell family was buried. Their plot was marked by a large angel monument weathered by over a century of Vermont seasons. 5 smaller stones surrounded it, each bearing a child's name, birth date, and the same death date, April 10, 1901. As I stood before the graves, an elderly groundskeeper approached. "You're Helen's granddaughter," he stated. "Not a question. Did you know my grandmother? Used to maintain her garden." He gestured toward the graves. "She'd come here every April 10th, bring flowers, talk to them sometimes." The Caldwell children? Why would she do that? He shrugged. Family's family, no matter how distant. Though she seemed more concerned with keeping them in their place than paying respects, if you ask me. What do you mean? Just things she'd say. Stay where you belong. The living have the house now. Strange talk. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. Sir, do you know anything about George Winters, the photographer? His expression darkened. Nasty business, that. After his daughter died, he got it in his head he could capture spirits with that camera of his. Said he'd developed a special emulsion chemicals mixed with water from Lake Champlain and I don't know what else. Claimed it could hold a soul in the space between worlds. He shook his head. Some said he was just a fraud, taking advantage of grieving parents. Others believed he was something worse. Worse? Some folks thought he wasn't just capturing souls, but binding them, keeping them from their rest. He glanced at the darkening sky. So you'd best get home before the storm hits. Bad one coming. As I drove back to the house, the first heavy raindrops splattered against my windshield. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the Victorian silhouette on the hill ahead. The house seemed to be waiting for me. As I approached the front door, I noticed water seeping out beneath it, soaking the welcome mat. Inside, puddles had formed in the entryway, trailing toward the basement door. The album lay open on the kitchen table, though I was certain I'd left it in the basement. It was turned to the final photograph, one I hadn't seen before. It showed only Edward and Martha standing alone on the porch. The space where the children had stood in the first photograph was now empty, save for a strange blur that distorted the image. A note had been placed beside it, written in my grandmother's handwriting. They come back when it rains. The lake calls to them, though it never claimed them. Winters bound them to the photographs, but they grow stronger each year. Keep the album closed. Keep the attic locked. If they appear, remind them of their true passing. They didn't drown. They never went to the lake that day. The house groaned around me as the storm intensified. Water now flowed freely down the basement stairs as if a spring had opened beneath the foundation. I followed the stream with my flashlight, descending carefully on the slippery steps. The basement floor was completely flooded, several inches deep. The mahogany chest floated like a miniature boat, its lid open. Inside, where the album had been, lay something I hadn't noticed before. A small glass vial containing murky water, labeled in faded ink, Champlain, August 1902, lake water, used in Winters' photographic emulsion. A splash behind me made me turn. Standing in the water were two small boys, their features blurred as if viewed through frosted glass. Behind them, three more figures gradually took shape, the girls, their white dresses floating around them in the rising water. You never drowned, I said, my voice shaking. You died of scarlet fever in April 1901. The tallest boy tilted his head. When he spoke, his voice sounded distant, as if coming from underwater. Mother said we drowned. Father showed us the lake. That was her grief speaking. She couldn't accept how you really died. The photographer promised we could stay together, the smallest girl said. He took pieces of us with his camera. The water continued to rise, now reaching my knees. The children remained just out of reach, their forms becoming more solid with each passing moment. You don't belong here, I told them, remembering my grandmother's words. You need to rest. We can't, the eldest boy said. We're bound to the house, to the album, to the lake that never took us. Understanding dawned on me. Winters hadn't merely photographed the children after their deaths. He had attempted something far more sinister, using his experimental emulsion. Containing lake water that symbolized Martha's delusion about their drowning, he had tried to bind the children's spirits to the physical world. The photographs weren't memorials, they were prisons. And now, with each exposure to the album, with each rainfall that mimicked the lake, they grew stronger, caught between worlds, unable to move on. I can help you, I said, an idea forming, but you have to trust me. The wind howled around the house as I carried the album to the kitchen table. The 5 children followed, leaving wet footprints that evaporated moments after they passed. They seemed more substantial now, their features clearer, though still distorted as if viewed through water. I laid out the photographs one by one. 12 images of a family that never was, moments fabricated after death, creating false memories that had trapped 5 young souls for over a century. Your mother couldn't accept that scarlet fever took you so suddenly, I explained. She created a different story, that you drowned in Lake Champlain. The photographer Winters used her delusion to bind you here. We remember both, Elizabeth said, her voice echoing strangely. The fever burning through us and the cold water filling our lungs. Sometimes I don't know which really happened. The fever was real, I insisted. Or the drowning was your mother's nightmare. The smallest boy, William, approached the table. His hand hovered over the photograph of the family by the lake. Father took us thereafter. Not our bodies, just us. He and the photographer. They had the water in bottles. For the emulsion, I murmured. Winters used lake water in his chemical process. Catherine, the middle girl, pointed to the vial I'd found. That's what holds us here. The water remembers us. Outside, lightning struck nearby, momentarily flooding the room with harsh light. In that flash, I saw the children as they truly were. Not the solid apparitions before me, but skeletal, withered forms, their flesh long gone. Empty eye sockets staring from faces still contorted in fever's final agony. When darkness returned, they appeared normal again, or as normal as spirits could be. I knew what needed to be done. The album and the vial are anchoring you here. If we destroy them, you might be free. Thomas, the second eldest, shook his head. Others have tried. Grandmother Helen burned photographs. But we always return with the rain, because the emulsion itself is the binding agent, I realized. Winters didn't just take your photographs after death. He created a ritual, using the lake water that represented your mother's delusion. James, the eldest, moved toward the basement door. There's more below, in the walls, in the foundation. I followed him down the stairs, where the water now reached my waist. The other children glided through it effortlessly. James pointed to the far wall where the original stone foundation was visible. Father mixed the emulsion into the mortar, he said. Winters told him it would keep us close. I waded to the wall and ran my fingers along the mortar between the stones. It had a strange, oily quality despite being over a century old. Looking closer, I could see faint impressions in the mixture, tiny handprints. He made us put our hands in it before it dried, Catherine explained. Said it would bind us to home forever. The house was itself a cage, reinforced by the photographs and the vial of lake water. No wonder my grandmother had warned about keeping the album closed. Each viewing strengthened their presence. There's only one way to break this, I said. We need to correct the story. You've never drowned. The lake has no claim on you. I waded back upstairs, the children following. In the kitchen, I gathered the photographs and the vial. We need to go to your graves, to remind you and the world how you really died. As we moved toward the door, the house began to shake. Plaster rained down from the ceiling. The windows rattled in their frames. The house won't let us leave, James said. We've tried before. A tremendous crack split the kitchen floor, water gushing up through the opening. The house itself was fighting to keep its prisoners. Then we'll make the house part of the truth, I declared, an idea forming. If we can't leave, we'll bring your true resting place here. The storm raged as I drove to the cemetery, windshield wipers barely keeping up with the downpour. I'd left the children at the house, promising to return quickly. The graveyard was deserted, mud puddles forming between the headstones. I made my way to the Caldwell plot, where rainwater streamed down the Angel Monument. I knelt before the 5 small graves, clearing away leaves and debris to reveal the inscriptions. Each stone told the truth. James, Thomas, Elizabeth, Catherine, and William Caldwell, all claimed by scarlet fever on April 10, 1901. Using my phone, I photographed each gravestone, making sure the dates were clearly visible. Then I gathered a small amount of soil from each grave, placing the samples in separate plastic bags. As I worked, the rain briefly subsided. In that moment of calm, I noticed something I'd missed before. At the base of each child's headstone was a small, weathered carving, a tiny handprint, matching those I'd seen pressed into the foundation mortar. Edward Caldwell had created a dual anchor for his children's spirits, binding them to both the house and their graves, trapping them in an eternal limbo. By the time I returned to the house, the storm had intensified. The structure groaned and shifted as if alive, water now flowing freely from every drain and faucet. The 5 children waited in the parlor, their forms flickering like candle flames. I brought evidence, I told them, displaying the photographs of their gravestones on my phone. And something else. I carefully placed a small amount of soil from each grave in a circle on the parlor floor. The children watched with solemn curiosity. This is from your true resting place, I explained. Your bodies returned to the earth here, not to the lake. I placed the album and the vial in the center of the dirt circle, then added the final ingredient, a family photograph I'd found in Grandma's collection. It showed her as a young woman standing beside an elderly man. This is Edward Caldwell, your father, 50 years after your deaths, I told them. He lived on, tormented by what he'd done. This was taken shortly before his death in 1953. The children stared at the photograph in confusion. But Father died in 1903, James said. He joined us. No, I corrected gently. That's what you were made to believe. Another false memory created by the binding ritual. Your father lived a long life, though not a happy one. He was consumed by guilt over trapping you here. The revelation seemed to shake something loose. The children's forms wavered, becoming less distinct. The drowning memory was your mother's delusion, I continued. The early death of your father was your own wishful thinking. Both untrue. You died of fever. Your parents lived on. These are the facts that can free you. Outside, lightning struck the massive oak beside the house. A deafening crack was followed by the groaning collapse of its trunk against the roof. Rain poured in through the new opening, but instead of flooding the room, the water seemed to hover in midair, forming a transparent barrier between me and the children. Through this watery veil, I saw their expressions change from confusion to gradual understanding. Their forms became increasingly translucent. Break the cycle, I urged them. Accept your true deaths. Reject the false drowning. Leave the lake behind. I struck a match and dropped it onto the album. The ancient pages caught quickly, flames consuming the photographs that had held them in false memory for over a century. Next, I broke the vial, letting the lake water spill into the burning album where it hissed and evaporated. The house shuddered violently. Cracks appeared in the walls, spreading like spider webs across the plaster. From the basement came the sound of stone grinding against stone as the foundation began to crumble. The children were barely visible now, their forms little more than faint outlines in the rain-soaked air. The watery barrier between us thinned, droplets falling to join the circle of earth I'd created. It's working, I encouraged them. Feel the truth. Remember the fever, not the water. One by one, they placed their fading hands into the soil from their graves. As they did, their forms became momentarily more solid. But in a different way, no longer the wet, blurred apparitions of drowning victims, but children in the final stages of scarlet fever, flushed cheeks, bright eyes, rash-covered skin. I remember, Elizabeth whispered. Mother reading to us while we burned with fever. Father crying in the hallway, added Thomas. The doctor shaking his head, said Catherine. We never went to the lake that summer, William realized. Because we were already gone, James concluded. The burning album was nearly consumed now, the photographs curling and blackening. As the last image turned to ash, a profound change came over the children. Their fever-marked forms began to age backward, returning to health, becoming whole again. For a brief moment I saw them as they truly were in life, 5 vibrant children with rosy cheeks and bright eyes, untouched by fever or drowning or the manipulations of a grieving family and an unscrupulous photographer. They smiled at me, genuine smiles, not the vacant stares from the photographs, and then they were gone. The house gave one final tremendous shudder. Plaster fell from the ceiling, windows shattered, and the floor beneath me groaned. I barely made it out the front door before the entire structure began to collapse in on itself. From the safety of the street, I watched as my grandmother's house, the Caldwell house, slowly folded inward, as if being drawn down into the earth. Water erupted from every opening, not ordinary rainwater, but a dark, viscous fluid that smelled of chemicals and lake mud. By morning, nothing remained but a water-filled crater where the house had stood. Emergency crews cordoned off the area, attributing the collapse to foundation damage from the storm and possible underground springs. No one questioned the disappearance of a century-old album or 5 children who had died long ago. No one except me. A week later, I visited the cemetery again. The Caldwell plot had changed. The angel monument remained, but the 5 gravestones appeared newer somehow. The inscriptions clearer, the small handprints at their bases gone without a trace. As I stood there, the elderly groundskeeper approached. Shame about your grandmother's house, he said. Been standing since 1898. Some things aren't meant to last forever, I replied. He nodded toward the graves. Been tending these plots for 40 years. Funny thing, never noticed until today that they all had the same epitaph. I looked closer. Below each child's name and dates was a line I hadn't seen before. At rest at last. In truth and love. The words appeared freshly carved, yet weathered by decades of Vermont seasons, as if they had always been there, waiting to be noticed once the truth was restored. Your grandmother left something for you, the groundskeeper said, handing me a small package wrapped in faded tissue paper. Asked me to give it to you if anything ever happened to the house. Inside was a letter in Grandma, Helen's handwriting, and a small silver key I didn't recognize. The letter was dated 10 years earlier when Grandma Helen had still been lucid and strong. My dearest granddaughter, it began. If you're reading this, then you've discovered the truth about our family and the house is no more. I've watched over them for decades, keeping the album closed, the attic locked, trying to contain what Edward and Martha Caldwell set in motion. The Caldwells were my great-grandparents. Their tragedy became our inheritance, 5 souls bound to false memories and a house that became their prison. I tried many times to free them, but the binding was too strong, reinforced by years of belief. Perhaps you succeeded where I failed. If so, the enclosed key will open a safe deposit box at Burlington National Bank. Inside is the true account of what happened, written by Edward Caldwell in his final years. He entrusted it to my father, who passed it to me. The account is yours now to preserve or destroy as you see fit. Some family histories are better left buried, but some truths demand to be known. Whatever you decide, know that you've broken a cycle of suffering that has haunted our family for generations. The children are at peace. The house is gone. The lake has no hold on us anymore. With all my love, Grandma Helen. The safe deposit box contained a leather-bound journal filled with Edward Caldwell's cramped handwriting. The entries spanned 5 decades from 1902 to 1953, documenting his growing realization of what he and Winters had done and his futile attempts to undo it. The final entry, dated just days before his death, read, "I see them clearly now. They truly were my children in their beds, consumed by fever, not cold and drowned as Martha imagined. I invited Winters into our grief, allowed him to exploit Martha's delusions, helped him bind our children to a false memory in a house built on deception. For 50 years I've lived with the consequences. The house has become a mausoleum, keeping them neither truly dead nor truly at peace. I've tried everything to free them, destroyed photographs, altered the foundation, even attempted to burn the house itself, but something always stops me. Perhaps only someone of our blood, but not bound by our guilt, can finally break the cycle. To whoever reads this, remind them of the truth, show them their true resting place, help them understand that the lake never claimed them, free them from the prison I helped create." I closed the journal, watching as the setting sun cast long shadows across the cemetery. In the distance, Lake Champlain reflected the golden light, peaceful and ordinary, just water, not a supernatural prison for lost souls. I considered what to do with Edward's journal and my grandmother's letter. These were pieces of my family history, documenting a tragedy twisted by grief into something darker. In the end, I decided to place digitized copies with the Burlington Historical Society, with the provision that they remain sealed for another 50 years. The original journal and letter I kept, a reminder of what I had witnessed and the peace I had helped restore. As for the land where the Caldwell house once stood, I donated it to the city with the stipulation that it become a small park. No structure would ever again be built on that foundation. They named it Caldwell Children's Park and erected a simple stone monument bearing 5 names and a quote selected from Edward's journal. "Remember them as they truly were, not as grief imagined them to be." That autumn, as the leaves turned brilliant red and gold, I returned to Burlington to see the newly completed park. A winding path led visitors through native plantings to a small clearing where the house had once stood. The depression had been transformed into a peaceful pond, ringed by smooth stones and wooden benches. Families with children played nearby, their laughter carrying on the crisp October breeze. No one seemed to notice anything unusual about the place. No cold spots, no unexplained sounds, no children appearing in the rain. As I sat beside the pond, a small girl in a red jacket approached, kneeling to watch the fallen leaves floating on the water's surface. "My grandma says people used to think this was a sad place," she said without looking up. "But it's not sad anymore." "No," I agreed, "it's not." She smiled, revealing a missing front tooth, then ran back to her waiting family. As they walked away, I noticed 5 maple saplings planted in a gentle arc at the far edge of the clearing, each tagged with a small bronze plaque bearing a name: James, Thomas, Elizabeth, Catherine, and William. Professor Barrett found me there as the afternoon light began to fade. "I thought I might find you here," he said, settling beside me on the bench. "I've been researching George Winters since you left. Fascinating case." "What did you discover?" "He disappeared in 1903, shortly after Edward Caldwell's supposed suicide attempt. His equipment was found abandoned in his studio, but there was no sign of the man himself." He paused. There was a final entry in his appointment book, a session scheduled with Martha Caldwell at the asylum, though she was in no condition to consent to such a thing. "Do you think Edward Caldwell killed him?" I asked. "The evidence suggests something more complex." He handed me a faded photograph. This was in the Historical Society archives, unlabeled and forgotten. The image showed George Winters himself standing beside his camera. Behind him, barely visible in the shadowy background, were 5 small figures with indistinct features. "My theory is that Winters became trapped in his own creation," the professor said quietly. "The binding ritual he performed affected not just the subjects, but the photographer himself." A chill ran through me despite the afternoon warmth. "The children took him, perhaps. Or perhaps he's still out there somewhere, neither living nor dead. Like the children, we're caught in the space between worlds." As if on cue, a gust of wind swept across the pond, rippling its surface. For just a moment, I thought I saw faces reflected in the water, not the tormented spirits I had encountered in the house, but 5 peaceful children, finally at rest. Some family histories are buried for a reason, I said, remembering my grandmother's words, but burying the truth only creates deeper wounds. The professor nodded. What will you do now? I watched as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in twilight shadow. Move forward, remember. Make sure this never happens again. Later that evening, as I packed my hotel room for departure the next morning, I received an unexpected package. Inside was a small silver frame containing a photograph I'd never seen my grandmother as a young woman, standing with an elderly Edward Caldwell. On the back, in my grandmother's handwriting, the album is gone, the house is gone, the children are at peace. Some burdens end with us. As I placed the photograph in my suitcase, I noticed something in its background I hadn't seen before. 5 children playing in a sunlit garden. Their faces clear and happy, untouched by fever or drowning or the passage of time. Just ordinary children, captured in an ordinary camera. Just a family photograph, nothing more. Or perhaps, after all that had happened, the most extraordinary gift of all the Caldwell children, finally remembered as they truly were.